All right, well, I don't hear too many more favorite people joining the conference call, so I think we'll get things underway. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Jason Edwards, and I'm a Forestry Adaptation Research and Knowledge Exchange Officer with the Canadian Forest Service here in Edmonton, Alberta. I'll be your host, moderator, and first presenter for today. The primary focus of today's webinar and the webinar scheduled for later this week on Thursday and Friday is to provide an overview of the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers' approach to adapting sustainable forest management to climate change. These webinars are offered in advance of an upcoming workshop being held in Edmonton on January 29th to 31st. They're targeting provincial and territorial government representatives to help assist them in understanding what the approach to adaptation is that the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers has developed over the last couple of years. Of course, we welcome all others who have joined in today as we highlight the first two reports in the new Sustainable Forest Management Climate Change Adaptation Report Series that's being produced by the CCFM. Today's webinar is being hosted by the Forestry Adaptation Community of Practice, otherwise known as the FACoP. The FACoP is an online site dedicated to persons interested in climate change impacts and adaptation options for forestry in Canada. The purpose of this online space is to share information and best practices on current activities in the area of climate change vulnerability and adaptation assessment in Canada's forest sector. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on the FACoP site for future viewing. If you're not already a member of the site and you wish to join, please contact me or Annette Moran, whose email is up on the left-hand side of your screen there in the chat section. Before we begin the webinar, just a few housekeeping items. All lines have been muted when you join in the conference. If you wish to unmute or mute your line to ask a question, press *6. The webinar program also has a chat option on the left-hand side of your screen for anyone wanting to type in a question or for the presenters, or to let us know if you're having any technical issues with the conference call or the webinar program. Without further delay, please let me introduce myself and get on with the presentations. My role here at CFS is to conduct research on adaptation in Canada's forest sector, as well as provide knowledge exchange on climate change impact and adaptation in order to assist forest practitioners across Canada with adaptation efforts. For the past 2.5 years, a large part of my effort has been focused on the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers' Climate Change Task Force activities as a member of the Task Force Technical Analysis Team. And it's this work today that I'd like to highlight. First report that is coming out in the series is referred to as Preparing for the Future. It's co-authored by myself and by Kelvin Hirsch of the Canadian Forest Service as well. The presentation today, I just hope to overview and characterize the case for sustainable forest management adaptation in Canada, and to introduce and highlight the CCFM approach to sustainable forest management adaptation and climate change. As I'm sure many of you are aware, forestry in Canada is focused around sustainable forest management in hopes that we can achieve a range of multiple values that are presented by our forest, or available to us through our forest. Sorry, I lost my focus. Anyway, the idea behind sustainable forest management is hopefully balance our economy, society, and environmental values for a range of forestry practices for the future. Apologies. Of course, one of the concerns that we have is that the world is warming. Taking a look at this chart here, you can see that over the past couple of decades, we've had a considerable warming in the world's temperature of over the land and the oceans. This is particularly important for forestry in the fact that most of the trees that we have on the land base today were established and grown in conditions that were considerably different than what we're currently experiencing now. Some of the projections of future climate envelopes based on this increase in temperature suggesting that many tree species may shift at a rate far beyond the natural capacity of the trees to migrate. Additionally, most of the growth and yield productivity models we use to project future forest conditions have been based on climate conditions quite different than what are currently being experienced. impacts are also being today. It's not necessarily something that we should be concerned about in the future. There's growing literature and evidence from practice that show climate-relevant impacts on our forests, ranging everything from the mountain pine beetle in the west to have some dieback into the prairies, and a lot of winter harvesting issues on operation scale that we're experiencing across Canada. What is challenging in the context of climate change, the change and subsequent impacts on the forest will not be equal across Canada. The impacts on stable forest management objectives will also be kind of localized, which makes it very hard to actually predict our future and to develop options and practices that allow us to deal with that new future. Begs the question of what do we do today to deal with a range of different possible futures? How do we make decisions under a growing uncertainty? In short, it's a whole new ballgame. Huge ain't where it used to be, as Yogi Berra has shared with us in his insights. If the forest sector is to realize its goals of long-term sustainable forest management, new knowledge about the impacts of climate change on sustainable forest management systems and new tools and decision support systems to enable successful proactive adaptation will be required. Adaptation is needed to address the challenges of climate change and represents a necessary complement to mitigation efforts that are currently ongoing in the forest sector in Canada. Long-term investments, if any significant delays or inaction to any adaptation will create rising costs and irreversible conditions, possibly missed opportunities from any opportunities presented by climate change. All this points to the need for effective adaptation to reduce the risk and maximize the opportunities related to climate change in the context of Canada's forest sector. Adaptation is seen as an adjustment in natural or human systems in response to actual or expected climatic stimuli or their effects which moderates harm or exploits beneficial opportunities. In short, successful adaptation, hopefully proactive in nature, allows us to extend a bit of our coping range into an uncertain future. Fortunately, it's not just the science push that is calling for the need for adaptation, but we've actually had a bit of a policy poll over the last number of years, suggesting that it's a route to take and that we need to address it now. In 2008, the Premiers asked the Council Federation, the Premiers asked the Forest Ministers to collaborate on the federal government. And at the same time, the CCFM produced a vision statement which called for the consideration of climate change and future climate variability to be included in all aspects of sustainable forest management. Now, unfortunately, my computer connection has been lost to you guys. Annette, are you able to continue on with the presentation?
Yep.
So that was slide 11. Sorry, I've lost all my connections here.
That's okay. I can advance the slide. So right now we're on slide 11.
Yeah.
Okay.
So through the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers, in response to the call for the action by the Premiers, formed a task force to address the issue of climate change adaptation and sustainable forest management. In the next slide, does it show up for you guys?
Yes.
Right. That's the call for action by the Premiers and by the Ministers of Canada to take action on sustainable forest management adaptation in Canada. The response that the task force has produced through the work of a technical analysis group was a tree species vulnerability assessment report by Dr. Mark Johnston, the Saskatchewan Research Council. And this first report addressed only tree species, and it took a look at the vulnerability of tree species across Canada to climate change, and it also presented a number of management options for adaptation identify a number of key knowledge gaps. This report is currently being used by many jurisdictions to address their assessment forest policies and practices in a climate change context. Of course, sustainable forest management is much more than just trees. It's also about achieving values of society and economic values for Canada. So the second phase of the response to the ministers and to the premiers was a comprehensive report series on how to actually understand climate change in a sustainable forest management context and identify potential vulnerabilities of our current practices and policies and what we can maybe do about it. The outcome of that second phase is a series of reports addressing these vulnerabilities and providing tools and knowledge to forest practitioners and policymakers across Canada to address climate change. First report was is the one I'm highlighting today, which is context setting and the preparing for the future. Second report, which will be discussed here right after following me by Paul Gray, is on organizational readiness. So the first question we always ask ourselves is, are we actually willing and able and prepared to do something slightly different, to take a look at what we do and address any potential vulnerabilities. It's a framework that helps an organization to assess the degree to which it is ready to adapt. It's a structured thought process that an organization can use to determine its willingness and capacity to undertake a vulnerability assessment and implement adaptation options. Third report, which will be highlighted by Dr. Tim Williamson on Thursday morning, is the blueprint behind all of this work, and it's the vulnerability assessment framework. This framework presents a flexible and broadly applicable assessment that enables forest managers to better understand how sustainable forest management is vulnerable to current and potential future climatic conditions, and how such information can be incorporated into adaptation decision-making on an ongoing basis. Currently in draft form, and which we'll be highlighting and presented at the workshop in Edmonton, is a guidebook for following this process along in adapting policies and practices across Canada. It's currently in the draft form and is not approved yet, but we'll be working through it anyhow at the workshop. And the other idea is to actually get through the vulnerability framework and to get to successful proactive adaptation. We also have to understand a range of potential futures. The fifth report in this series is how to develop scenarios of sustainable forest management. And it explains what the scenarios are, examines the different types that exist, and describes how they can be used in vulnerability assessments to explore the impacts of climate change on sustainable forest management and to develop robust adaptation strategies. The sixth report in the series is about measuring our adaptive capacity. This is a somewhat new field in research on the social side. And it addresses our abilities as organizations and society to actually address climate change and do something about it. Tim Williamson will be presenting that on Friday morning. As part of this process, there have been a number of ongoing vulnerability assessment case studies across Canada that we've been able to take a look and see what made them successful or what kind of lessons they learned about the adaptation process as they went forth. That report is summarized in a vulnerability assessment case studies currently under review by the Council of Forest Ministers. We've also looked at a number of options, such as assisted tree migration. The assisted tree migration is somewhat of a controversial issue. It requires a bit of understanding and a bit of definition. Assisted tree migration report presents the range of options that people can take to go forth on. My apologies. My computer system is not working here and I can't follow along. Of course, the way we define sustainable forest management in Canada is through indicators and criterion indicators. The ninth report in this series is all about taking another look at the sustainable forest management criterion indicators in Canada and if they need to be altered or modified at all to address climate change. This report is currently under review by the task force, but it is also supported by James Steenberg and Peter Gunter out of Halifax, and they have just recently produced a manuscript on that, and I can pass along to anybody that's interested. Be able to advance forward for me. The first 4 reports should be available for release here this week. They'll be available on the CCFM website at www.ccfm.org. I encourage everybody to take a look at these. They are the basis for the workshop that is coming up in Edmonton. And understanding the tools and knowledge that we present in these is quite critical for being able to work through the guidebook that we'll be working through in Edmonton. Next slide, please. Of course, it's one thing to produce a bunch of knowledge and tools for people to use, but it's another thing to actually get them to understand and present opportunities for them to understand how to use them and apply them in their context. As part of the Climate Change Task Force work, we've been conducting a number of workshops and presentations across Canada on these activities and the reports that we have produced, as well as we've supported the establishment of a forestry adaptation community of practice, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation during the introduction. This community of practice is a place that we can share information and best practices on current activities around climate change vulnerability assessment in Canada's forest sector. The best thing we can do is, if we're going to an uncertain future, is to learn from each other as we go through this process. This site provides that opportunity and connects a lot of people across Canada that are working on climate change adaptation assessment in Canada. If you are interested in joining this site, please let me know or let Annette know, and we can sign you up. It's free to join. It's just let us know and we can sign you up. Next slide, please. So moving forward, climate change poses a number of challenges to sustainable forest management in Canada, especially in terms of how best to plan and adapt for an uncertain future. Adapting sustainable forest management to climate change requires a proactive and collaborative effort by all members of Canada's forest sector, and the CCFM is contributing to this effort by providing a common approach to adaptation that forest managers and practitioners can apply across Canada. Over the next few days of webinars, we hope to present that approach to you and present the details in a fashion that allows you to actually take these tools and use them in your work. And if you have any questions, you can go back to us for the next slide. Of course, this work wasn't just by a few of us. It takes quite a bit of. Right. This work has been produced by the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers Climate Change Task Force and our technical analysis group. The names are listed here on this page, but of course include a whole host of other people that have provided feedback, background information, and insight into these products and tools. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. The idea today was to just present a bit of a context of climate change in Canada and its impacts on sustainable forest management, as well as introduce to you the Climate Change Task Force adaptation series that we'll be presenting over the next few days. At this time, I'll unmute the line for any questions. And once again, I apologize for the presentation. I was having a lot of issues here on my end, following along on the screen. So I'll open up the lines here for any questions. You also feel free to type in a chat question if you prefer that method. And then Annette will change over the presentation to Paul, and Paul will continue on with an introduction to organizational readiness. Thank you.
The conference has been unmuted. Le mode discrétion a été enlevé de la conférence.
Question here from Gary Nielsen.
Hi, Gary.
Yeah, good day. I wonder if you could just put on the screen the web address or the link for the Adaptation Community Practice. We're talking to our forest management folks actually this afternoon, and something we need to pass along to in Ontario.
Okay. The Adaptation Community Practice website, as you see on the left-hand side there, it's www.ccadaptation.ca. And the forestry adaptation community of practice is actually a subset, there's a side group of a larger community of practice dealing with climate change adaptation in all sectors in Canada. Membership or sign up gives you access to both those sites. Unfortunately, it is password protected due to the technology and the program that's used to run the community of practice. So it's not visible present to a wide audience, but anybody is free to join, so just let us know. And we'll gladly sign you up, and you guys can feel free to explore the site.
So if we pass on the ccadaptation.ca link to all the foresters in Ontario, then they can get at it through that link, right?
They can, yep. Well, they'll have to either email Ned or myself to join.
Okay.
And then they can get.
So I need to give them a two-part instruction.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Email us, and then we'll send the information to them to get onto the site.
Very good.
Any other questions? All right. Well, without any further delay, I'd like to introduce Paul Gray from the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources. Paul has been a member of the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers Climate Change Task Force and the Technical Analysis Group since its inception. And he would like to present to you today his report on a systematic approach for exploring organizational readiness. Thank you, Paul.
Thanks, Jason. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Good. Good. Well, thanks for the invitation to participate in this today. I think that personally this has been a very exciting project to work on over the years. It's involved people from across the country working in many different disciplines. And we have many of these people to thank for the products that are about to be released over the next few weeks and months. Many of the people on this list participated or had some role in all of the documents, but there are a few others on this list that specifically focused on providing comments for my document, and I appreciate that as well. So today I just wanted to spend some time talking about getting ready to engage in adaptation or in enhancing opportunities to adaptation, because of course while mitigation has dominated the agenda for years, there's now widespread recognition of the need to get on with the business of adaptation, so that we're in a situation now where agencies and companies and organizations are being asked to continue on with mitigation, which historically has met with so-so success, while at the same time recognizing the need that it's time to get on with adaptation. So agencies and organizations are now in the process of wrestling with both of these concepts, and in a number of areas they overlap. So it's not as if they're mutually exclusive. I think that as we move forward, we need to be thinking about both and how to manage effectively for both. I think that it's fair to say that many aspects of adaptation leads us into uncharted territory, although I must add too that I personally think that the forest sector as well as the agricultural sector are, if not through experience, they're strategically positioned to move into the adaptation realm quite quickly by virtue of the work that they've done to date, and of course by virtue of the fact that on the forest sector side, and I'll get to this in a few minutes, that we actually do operate according to a strategic vision. So, for years, many of us went to meetings, and the focus of those meetings was on mitigation. And when suggestions came forward that it was time to sort of begin to start talking about adaptation, that suggestion to get on with the business of adaptation. And unfortunately, it's not, as Kelvin Hirsch talks about it, it's not a simple matter of throwing a couple of granola bars in a backpack and climbing Mount Everest. There's a little bit of a process here to figure out where we are, what we've got, and what we need to move into the future with a reasonable suite of tools. Particularly in view of the fact that the status quo obviously isn't going to be a viable option. While there's some things that we do know will contribute to any commitment to adapt, in all likelihood there's need for some significant change and some additional new programs to round out our approach. So, particularly in view of the fact that we're being confronted by a number of novel issues, things like the fact that we can't use the past or old plans to plan our way forward, which we have used or done consistently in the past. It's clear that climate change is going to affect all aspects of society and every ecosystem. So these things are going to change in very unique ways, and we're not going to need the capacity or the ability to recognize that unique change and to respond to it. It also brings into question our definition or our thoughts around the concept of sustainability and what we might need to think about in terms of a commitment to sustainability, given the uncertainty of rapid climate change and the potential for significant change. In that light, it's our sense that decisions about natural assets and climates that haven't arrived yet are likely going to require new and nimble and robust governance tools and techniques that allow us to monitor the validity of our decisions and make changes rapidly when we recognize that perhaps those decisions are no longer relevant or were in fact incorrect. Which leads to a little bit of a discussion about the need for perhaps a bit of a reorganization about how we make decisions. There's a sense that there's a lack of safe-to-fail policies or understanding in agencies and organizations, and what that has done historically is led to risk-averse behavior by decision makers. If we know that we're going to be punished for mistakes, even though we do our best to project into the future and do our best to be adaptive, that is going to lead to risk-averse behavior. And so there needs to be some discussion about that in the context of how we organize our decision-making going forward, and the types of people who we engage in our decision-making as we go forward. In addition to that, there's a sense that we need to continue and along with the business of trying to value ecological goods and services in forested ecosystems, particularly when we're talking about significant change as we go forward, and particularly in view of the fact that we're talking about a variety of values that we may want to gain access to or continue to use from the forest as climate changes. And last but not least, there's a sense that we may need to constantly evaluate sort of where we are in terms of our capacity to respond to this uncertainty and ongoing change. And so the question is, do we have that type of process in place? And this concept of organizational readiness is one of the things that we're going to talk about today. And for all intents and purposes, it's just simply an exploration of how organizations and agencies and companies are structured, and what are the types of questions that staff and partners might ask themselves when they're looking at these agencies and organizations and trying to figure out the best way forward. So the theme of this particular product relates to helping jurisdictions and companies across the country ask the right questions of themselves in order to help them prepare particular document is intended to help staff who are assigned the task of trying to sort out where we are in the milieu around adaptation. Tim Williamson and his authors will talk about an adaptation process that is available. There are many adaptation processes available, but this is one that was worked on by the TAG group under the auspices of the CCFM. And so the idea here is to provide or help staff ask a whole series of questions that would prepare them to engage and complete an adaptive management process, which will be talked about by Ken Williamson in the next video. So the report itself is organized around the idea that there are three lenses or three windows into agencies and organizations through which you might want to organize your thoughts about the types of questions that you can ask yourself. Space and time is one. That's an obvious one. Another one we call community empowerment, and the third one relates to collecting and employing knowledge. And we recognize that capacity to adapt is going to take on many forms, and all of the concepts in these three windows are all interrelated. They're not mutually exclusive by any stretch of the imagination. And we're not suggesting that this is suggesting this as a prescriptive tool, but something that simply provides an optional number of themes that may be relevant to people who have been asked to look at the adaptive capacity of their organization. So under the auspices of these three windows or lenses, we're suggesting that agencies and organizations complete a number of tasks that collectively embody the product or the result of the work of that organization. We have developed 10 themes to sort of help people characterize their organization. And the first one relates to place and time. I mean, just about everything that we do is based on four-dimensional space and time, our perception of it, our use of it as individuals in relation to each other. It's a hugely important aspect of how we gather our knowledge about forested ecosystems and how we make decisions at a variety of levels. And of course, in Canada, we use a number of spatial frameworks to make decisions. We use administrative frameworks, whether they're counties and districts or provinces. We use thematic frameworks, whether it's provincial parks or wildlife management areas. And in addition to that, we use an ecological approach as well. And quite often jurisdictions use all three by virtue of the questions and the issues that they're asked to deal with. From a climate change adaptation perspective, we're not suggesting that one particular classification system be used without any of the others, but we do suggest that an ecological classification system does have benefits from the perspective that these things tend to be somewhat ecologically meaningful. They tend to be somewhat hierarchical in that we can identify on the basis of a set of boundary rules large systems and small systems. And it seems that different levels of government and companies and organizations work at different levels, work with big systems and small systems. And so the idea here, as we move forward in the development of adaptation tools and techniques, is to explore opportunities where people who are making decisions about smaller areas are somehow connected to people who are making decisions about larger areas and vice versa, so that there's some semblance of agreement, fluidity of contact, so that our policies and procedures don't necessarily conflict with one another or create perverse incentives that wouldn't help, that don't help us move the yardsticks around adaptation. So we're also, of course, very interested with time, and historically, natural asset practitioners have had a difficult time establishing and working with programs in the long term by virtue of 4-year election cycles and by virtue of 1- and 2-year budget cycles and many other types of cycles that we tend to cope with. But with climate change, we're into a situation where we're looking at long-term trends, we're looking at long-term lag effects, and consequently we need the capacity to be able to sort of understand what's happening in the long term, and we need the capacity to be able to project and provide options well into the future if we want to be strategic and develop appropriate pathways. And in doing that, there's a requirement or an expectation that we're going to be able to monitor change as it occurs or as we move through into the future. And that requires a long-term commitment to things like inventory and monitoring and research and science to try to understand what's happening and to use that to turn around and inform the quality of our decisions and adjust accordingly. So the next group of ideas around how agencies and organizations operate and the suite of questions that people might ask themselves are fairly straightforward, starting with a suite of principles and values, which surprisingly in the literature is not mentioned at all or very little. I just looked at a couple of papers that reviewed 22 years of adaptive strategies, and virtually none of them talk about underlying principles and indicators of trust that actually equip agencies and organizational staff to move forward and, according to a set of principles in the context of making decisions. So this is one area where agencies and organizations might want to sit down and take a look at. Ministry of Natural Resources in Ontario, for example, has a set of principles published under the auspices of the Environmental Bill of Rights, and those principles are used to guide decisions in the use of many natural assets across the province. So another component, somewhat related to that, of course, is the whole concept of strategic planning around principles and ensuring that those principles are embedded in strategic plans. And again, I think that the forestry community is well on its way. If you look at the CCFM strategic plan vision statement, it does in fact include a number of principles, everything from innovation to stewardship and transparency, partnership and accessibility. And of course, all of those things, particularly transparency, are important in terms of establishing trust with clients and partners and the general public. And we think that if in next iterations there was consideration for adding a principle around learning, this set of principles would actually be quite well-rounded and quite supportive of any commitment to move forward in an adaptive context. With the values component, again, agencies and organizations might want to sit down and ask themselves, well, what are the values for which we have responsibility for, and do we understand what those values are, and can we translate those values in the context of neoclassical dollars and cents, or can we relate it in terms of quality of life standards or whatever? I mean, there's a number of different frameworks in which you can relate the values, but the point being here is that there are a suite of ecological goods and services that are going to be affected by climate change, and in order to be strategic and set forward new ideas ideas about sustainability, we need to understand how these ecological goods and services are valuable to us now and how those values might change through time with climate change. So again, another series of questions around how we value natural assets out there and how we interpret those values. A really important one, a really complex one, not one that I can profess to have a great deal of expertise with, one in which there's just an incredible number of volumes and libraries about organizational structure and function and how people come together to develop products or to relate or to carry on in the world. I think it's a fundamental requirement of agencies and organizations on the forest sector side to sort of look at how they're organized internally to themselves to determine whether or not that is in fact any commitment to engage in adaptive management. Some organizations are strictly hierarchical top-down. Others are perhaps a little more matrix, so they're a little more flexible. This isn't a judgment of whether one or the other is bad. It's simply a statement that staff in these agencies and organizations that have been asked to sort of help find a way forward need to look at that structure, determine whether or not there are any significant barriers in the organization that would prohibit them from participating in that approach to management. And so the second to last piece in this particular theme of community empowerment relates to the question of whether or not we are empowered to lead. And I think that this harkens back a little bit to the work that gets done under the auspices of organizational structure and function, and whether or not people who are in fact in positions of leadership are equipped or are allowed to effectively lead in a time when perhaps change in some areas may have to be transformative as opposed to change around the edges, which in these times of great uncertainty, economic uncertainty and political uncertainty, makes it very difficult to explore transformative change in the context of how organizations and agencies actually work. But there's a sense that, and this appears quite often in the literature as well, fundamental to any commitment to move forward and adapt to climate change is the need for strong leadership to champion the cause and to lead the way. Now, leadership isn't necessarily something that is a tag for a CEO or a person currently located in the upper echelons of bureaucracies. Leadership also boils down right down to people working on the ground and working in communities and helping make decisions and facilitating decisions at the community level. And the question there is, are we training and empowering our people who are working at the community level to show leadership and to lead by example? So the question around leadership is something that has to be addressed throughout the ranks of any agency or organization in the context of how that agency wants to organize itself as it goes forward. And last but not least, in this particular group of themes is the whole concept of partnership. I think all of us on the line work for agencies and organizations that have huge experience with partnership, and I know that Canada is a partnership type of country, and we live and enjoy our successes around the large number and significant partnerships that we have with each other as we go forward. Because certainly no one owns all the resources and no one owns all the expertise, and the mix, the dynamic mix that can come together from partnerships from all sectors, depending on the need, is important. But in the context of adapting to climate change, there's a sense that we need to sort of evaluate our partnerships as we go forward to determine whether or not the ones that we have will work, and if not, what types of partnerships will work in a fairly uncertain world where change could be rapid, and we're probably going to end up dealing with all sorts of surprises as well. But, I mean, the bottom line is that partnerships are like sharks. They need to always be moving forward, and they always must be fed. And so it's not a simple matter of simply putting a bunch of people together. It's spending some thoughtful time figuring out the mandate of these partnerships and who's on them and how they can best work forward, and how the agencies or organizations that are sponsoring these partnerships can in fact keep them fed and keep them productive. So with that, I'd like to move on to the last sort of realm of things that activities that tend to occur within organizations and agencies. These are sort of the knowledge-driven tools and techniques that we use to make decisions that are, I guess, for all intents and purposes, enabled by the previous themes around community empowerment and place and time-based settings. So first on the list is strategic planning. And as I mentioned earlier, the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers has a strategic plan with a vision, and climate change is an important part of that plan and that vision. And I think it's probably fair to say that just about every organization and agency across Canada works to some type of strategic plan and some type of strategic vision. So this is certainly not new to us, but in the context of actually making a commitment to adaptation. And if there are cases, or if there are strategic plans where there are goals and quantified or measurable goals and objectives made in support of sustainable forest management, then the strategic plan itself probably needs to be examined from the perspective of going forward, given all of the uncertainty and the need to be nimble and quick off the mark in a relatively uncertain world. But as I mentioned earlier, I think that the forestry discipline, like farmers, are naturally strategic, naturally adaptive, and I think that the CCFM strategic plan and many of the others that are out there are sort of good starts to help agencies and organizations move forward. So from a forestry perspective, the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers strategic plan talks about identifying the impacts of climate change, assessing the impacts, and in fact developing the tools and techniques that jurisdictions and companies and organizations need to move forward. And it's in that context that agencies and organizations might want to take these strategic plans apart and evaluate them and put them in the context of where they want to go in the future, and then put them back together again. And that's the beautiful thing about strategic plans. As soon as you make them, then you start sort of critiquing them and tearing them down and looking at them and determining whether or not they continue to be relevant, and whether or not then create a new one. Next on the list relates to policy, and whether or not policy formulation can account for climate change in your agency or organization, and if it doesn't, what are the barriers and what needs to sort of be done. I think out of all of the tools and techniques that are available, this one is perhaps the most complex and the most perplexing by virtue of the number and the number of statutes and the number of policies and planning documents that are attached to those statutes and policies. So it's certainly no easy task by any stretch of the imagination, although I do know that forest management programs in a number of agencies across the country are exploring their policy options, and it's something that certainly needs to be done in the context of moving forward. So outside of saying that it would be to our advantage to have meaningful, nimble, perhaps a more flexible approach to policy development and application than we have had in the past, given the uncertainty and given the risk fair to say that a number of agencies across the country have begun to work on this. Also important, of course, to inform all aspects of an adaptive approach to management relates to how we collect, marshal, and use information. And of course, this implies that we're out there inventorying, we're out there monitoring, we're out there completing assessments, and we're supporting research that informs decision making as well. And I know for a fact that a number of agencies and companies do have robust information management programs. The question is, are we monitoring the right things? Do our criteria and indicators work? Do we have information management systems in place that would actually work in the context of an adaptive approach to management for rapid climate change? And are these programs, are these monitoring programs committed for the long term, and are the data that we're collecting actually relevant to the decisions that we're trying to make in the context of a rapidly changing climate? Again, these are all questions and answers that are probably going to have to be developed uniquely for each organization and agency across the country to determine where their information management system is in terms of its capability of helping decision makers plot a path forward. In my opinion, this is a hugely important part going forward, and I know that historically we've had an extremely difficult time finding monitoring and hanging on to monitoring money and programs. In the context of climate change, this is perhaps, in my opinion, one of the most important aspects of moving forward, and so any barriers that relate to that need to be looked at and disassembled where possible. We do have a number, as I mentioned, a number of programs up and running already, and it's amazing what our scientists and practitioners can come forward with in terms of responses to questions that we might ask. This particular question related to the known and potential distribution of possum in Ontario, and using models climate models as an end user, but also having access to a long-term database describing the distribution and in some cases abundance of this critter. Staff, Jeff Bowman, for example, in the research group here in Ontario, are able to talk about how these critters are responding to a variety of ecological changes that are occurring out there in the watershapes and on the landscape. So it's not as if we're starting from scratch, but we do suggest that it's important that we certainly ask ourselves questions about what we're collecting, why we're collecting it, its relevance to climate change, and whether or not we're going to be able to continue on with collecting this stuff through the decades, because it's at that scale that we're going to need to use this type of information to help us with decisions. So as I wind down, I want to talk a little bit about, I guess, the last two components of the tools and techniques side of it. And communication is critically important as well. Communication, I think on the climate change front, as we have all experienced over the last couple of decades, it's important. It can be difficult. The whole issue in many ways has been filled with misinformation, which a lot of us have had to try to wade through and clarify for our managers and for the public. So it's critically important that we ensure that as we understand how things are changing in our world, we're able to translate that knowledge in a variety of ways, whether it's through extension materials and education materials, or running training workshops, simply reporting as fact sheets or in newspapers or in webinars or on the radio. It's fundamental. And in my opinion, actually, information management around monitoring and research, and communication in terms of getting out there and talking about this are two of the key strategies that we need to, collectively as a discipline, need to engage in if we hope to garner the trust of our clients and our partners and move forward in an effective way, particularly in view of the fact that we're probably going to be working in situations where a significant amount of progress around climate change will occur at the community level. And so any successes and progress will happen from a community up. And as a result of that, it's important that we be able to provide knowledge and information about what's happening to their world, and we do this in a way that they can understand. So, again, it's, I think, incumbent upon us to ask ourselves whether or not we're collecting the right type of information, and how we're disseminating that information, and whether or not it's effective. So let's not just put the stuff out there and pat ourselves on the back. We need to be out there running surveys and bringing people in and trying to figure out exactly how well we're doing talking about this issue, and how well we're doing in engaging people in partnerships and in community science, and getting them to help us collect knowledge and information, because this issue is so big and all pervasive. It's not the solution is not one or two or three agencies getting together in partnership and charging ahead. It's some type of collective, hierarchical movement that has to happen from the community all the way up to the province and the national level. So as I end, I just want to suggest that as we move on to start to think about the implementation, we get back into the questions about, okay, what do we need to know and understand about climate change, and are the programs that we're supporting now, or are the programs that other groups are supporting, does that information help us move the yardsticks, and if not, where are our gaps? What are the types of roles that humans have in helping other humans adapt to changing ecosystems, and other human activities that can influence ecosystem change? I think we have to be honest with ourselves. The bulk of the work is going to be us humans adapting to climate change in a variety of contexts, and there may be some activities around the edges that we can engage in, whether it's assisted migration or improving habitat connectedness to facilitate natural movement of species, et cetera, well, we can certainly do that. A huge part of this issue is human-centered around how we as a species are going to respond from a natural perspective as well as a geoengineering perspective. So these are questions that also can be asked as you move forward. Exactly what is our mandate and our role in terms of delivering products on the ground, and how are they going to be affected by climate change? So this report simply summarizes some of these ideas, and then contains an appendix that uses the various themes in the report to provide some example questions that staff in agencies and organizations might want to look at and use to develop their own questions in order to assess their own agency. Again, this is not prescriptive, and someone may look at all these questions and say, none of them apply to us, but here are the questions that do. The whole point is that we feel it's important, at the very least, agencies and organizations need to sit down and ask themselves whether or not they are in a position to actually live the commitment that they so badly or they decided to make in broad level strategic statements about moving forward. So with that, and assuming that agencies have asked themselves
conference has been unmuted. Le mode discrétion a été enlevé de la conférence.
Hello.
Oh, I'm sorry, I was double muted there.
Oh, okay. Any questions or comments? Actually, there's a lot of questions. Probably more comments.
Yeah, so this time we'll take any questions for Paul, either through the chat or just by the phone here.
I'm speaking from Quebec. Paul, I would like to know who you think should be around the table to do this assessment within an organization. Is it the top level people or?
That's a great question, and I guess it all depends on how the organization is in fact organized. Because I think climate change is all pervasive and it's going to impact everybody all the way up and all the way down. I think it's probably beneficial to have representatives from sort of all levels in the organization somehow involved. I don't know if that's, selecting a core team to run a series of workshops or run a series of interviews of people working at different levels in the organization, and then develop a bit of a report and then solicit feedback on the basis of what this core team heard, or if it's a series of roundtable workshops and discussion groups. Or I guess it could be both. I had the pleasure of working in Zimbabwe a number of years ago, and at that time the government was, the agency that I was involved with was a very top-down organization, and they recognized, the permanent secretary of the day recognized they needed a significant reorganization. And given their history there, he decided that everyone from the park ranger who changes tires on a daily basis right through to the permanent secretary, which is the equivalent of the deputy minister, would be at that table. And over the course of a number of days and a few workshops, that organization took itself, looked at itself inside out and put itself back together again. And what was really huge as part of that exercise was the fact that the permanent secretary insisted that he sit at the table simply as one of the participants. And that blew the minds of all the people sort of who were down through the ranks that this was in fact happening. And it just created an amazing atmosphere. So, every organization is different, and you have to sort of pick and choose. And there's 5 or 6 different tools you can use. But I would recommend that whatever tool you pick, you should try and involve sort of all levels of the organization, given the significance of the potential implications of this particular issue.
Okay, thank you. And these tools are presented in your report, or?
No. There are some suggestions, but there are a number of great tools already available, and we can provide anybody who's interested with a list of those types of techniques if they're interested in engaging in a bit of a strategic review within an organization.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. Anyone else have any questions? Well, Brian, Stephen posted just more of a side note question, and it's just asking if the presentation will be available on the website. And yes, copies of these presentations, along with the recording of today's webinar, will be available on the FACoP website. You can also contact me directly via email if you'd like to have a copy of these presentations sent to you. don't have any other questions, I'd like to thank you all for taking the time today to hear a little bit about the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers' approach to adaptation.
Jason?
And hello?
Excuse me, Jason, if nobody else has a question, I have one more for Paul.
Okay, sure.
In your introduction, you said that agriculture and forestry sectors were on the right track to adapt to climate change. I understand that in forestry there is a strategic vision that was built and shared. Do you think, except being naturally adaptive, agricultural sector is on the same track? Do you think there is a strategic vision built and shared for agriculture?
Good question. I don't think I can talk too much about agriculture anywhere, particularly outside of Ontario, but I do know that there has been a fair bit of work sponsored by the Ministry of Agriculture and Food here in Ontario to engage stakeholders in tools and techniques to respond to climate change. At first, and it's still going on around mitigation, so looking at no-till options, for example, to sequester carbon in soil, looking at increased tree planting opportunities, and I think some are actually looking at intercropping as well. So there's that on the mitigation side. And I know that OMAFRA has also sort of engaged these groups somewhat strategically, simply by virtue of the fact that our farmers are now starting to experience extreme weather on a more frequent basis. And there's, I think, a sense that we do, in fact, need to be strategic. Now, Ontario has a strategic plan, a provincial level strategic plan called Climate Ready, to which all of us in the sister ministries work and respond. And that particular strategic plan addresses energy, it addresses natural resources, it addresses farming, it addresses water management, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's in that strategic context that our Ministry of Agriculture and Food responds as well.
Okay, thank you.
I'll take one more call for any questions. All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you, Paul, for presenting your work on organizational readiness. We do have two other webinars this week. One on Thursday morning, 9 o'clock Eastern, and one on Friday morning at 9 o'clock Eastern. The Thursday morning webinar will cover off the blueprint to adaptation, known as the Adaptation Framework, Vulnerability Assessment Framework from St. Livingston, as well as the scenarios report by David Price. And following that on Friday will be the Adaptive Capacity Assessment Framework, also produced by Tim Livingston and co-authored by Kendra Isaac. And we'd certainly like to have you all join us for those webinars as well. And I bid you all adieu. Thank you very much.